She was just the maid, until she was found naked in the master's bed. What he felt at that moment was not just desire, it was something forbidden. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. The rain was beginning to fall in dense veils when Michael Anderson returned to his family's old mansion, perched on a hill in Oakwood Hills, after nearly a year of forced seclusion in Vienna, where he had hidden from the media, creditors, and his own conscience. The flight back to America had been torturous, not just because of the 16-hour journey, but due to the weight of memories awaiting him. The mansion, a legacy of the empire founded by his father, an unscrupulous magnate whose absence was as present as his presence in life, now seemed older, more alive, as if it held breaths, echoes, and unrevealed pacts between its century-old walls. He hadn't told anyone he was returning, not even his childhood butler, Mr. Harrison, who still roamed the corridors like a faithful ghost, caring for the property with the devotion of someone who never knew how to do anything else. Michael needed silence, and perhaps redemption. The scandals that had forced him into voluntary exile still echoed in the American press. The fraudulent bankruptcy of the construction company, the apartments that collapsed in Riverside, the families who lost everything. His name was associated with greed and negligence, even though he had discovered his father's corruption only when it was already too late. The rusty gate creaked as it opened, like an ancient lament. The property was wilder than he remembered. Vegetation had taken over the French gardens his grandmother had loved so much, transforming them into a tropical jungle that swallowed the stone paths. The bougainvilleas grew rampantly over the walls, creating a vibrant purple canopy that filtered the afternoon light. It was as if nature was reclaiming what had always been hers. Michael climbed the marble steps, worn by time and the constant humidity of the hills. The keys still worked. Mr. Harrison had kept everything as if he had never left. Upon entering the main hall, the familiar smell of old wood, beeswax, and dried flowers invaded him like a nostalgic wave. The portraits of ancestors watched him from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge him for having fled, when he should have faced the consequences of crimes he hadn't committed, but for which he was responsible by inheritance. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silent vastness of the house. His luggage was still in the car. He wanted to revisit the past first before deciding if he would really stay. Upon reaching the second floor, he hesitated before the door of his old room, the one he had promised never to set foot in again after his father's violent death, found dead in that same bed on a winter morning, surrounded by medications and empty bottles. He took a deep breath and turned the golden doorknob. The door opened with a sigh, revealing the interior, bathed in the orange light of late afternoon filtering through the linen curtains. It was then that he found the image that would be etched in his mind like a curse. A young woman asleep on his sheets, undressed, her brown hair spread like damp shadows on the silk pillow, her breathing calm and deep, as if the world had forgotten to call her back. But it wasn't just the exposed body that made him stop at the threshold, his heart racing uncontrollably. It was the face, that delicate face with soft features, but marked by a premature hardness, a wild beauty that contrasted with the vulnerability of sleep, an impossible, disturbing resemblance to someone he had been trying to erase from his memory for years. It was as if time had tied a knot, as if fate wanted to play with his most secret ghosts. The skin golden from the sun of the Oakwood Hills coast, the freckles scattered across her shoulders, the gentle curve of her hips. Everything about her evoked a natural, unconscious sensuality that left him immobilized. She moved slightly in her sleep, murmuring incomprehensible words, and Michael felt something contract in his chest. It wasn't just desire, it was recognition. It was as if she belonged to that place, to that bed, to that moment in a way he couldn't understand. Michael remained there for long minutes, fighting against contradictory impulses. Part of him wanted to approach, wake her with a gentle touch, discover who this woman was who had invaded his most intimate sanctuary. Another part warned him of the danger of that encounter, of the unpredictable consequences of getting involved with someone in his current condition. He was too vulnerable, too wounded, to distinguish between salvation and self-destruction. Finally, Michael backed away in silence, closing the door with the care of someone who fears breaking a spell. He descended the stairs with trembling legs, heading straight to his father's study, where he still kept a bottle of 20-year-old Scotch whiskey. His hands trembled as he poured a double shot. The amber liquid burned his throat, but didn't erase the image that was now engraved on his retina like a hot iron. She was Emily Walker, he would discover later, talking with Mr. Harrison, the new housekeeper hired by his grandmother months before the sudden death of the matriarch last December. 24 years old, orphaned since 15, raised between religious shelters in Greenfield and temporary families who took her in more out of Christian charity than genuine love. She had accepted the job at the Anderson mansion not only for the promise of financial stability, $2,000 a month, room and board guaranteed, but for an inexplicable presentiment, a feeling that the property had been calling her forever. Emily had grown up hearing fragmented stories about her origin. She knew only that she had been abandoned as a baby at the door of a convent in Greenfield, with a falsified birth certificate and a small gold bracelet with her initials engraved. The nuns who raised her until she was 8 spoke vaguely of a very young mother, an unwanted pregnancy, a powerful man who refused to acknowledge paternity, details that Emily learned not to question, focusing her energy on surviving and studying. When the job offer came through a domestic employment agency in River City, Emily was working as a cleaner in 3 different houses in West Side, sleeping in a tiny room in a boarding house in Riverside. The opportunity to live in a historic mansion in Oakwood Hills, caring only for an elderly woman, and having free time to photograph, her secret passion, seemed too good to be true. Mrs. Margaret Anderson, the family matriarch, was an 82-year-old woman, elegant and severe, who spent her days between medications, soap operas, and old letters she obsessively reread. She treated Emily with distant politeness, but Emily noticed something deeper in her eyes, a melancholy, perhaps a guilt, that made her observe Emily with excessive attention, as if looking for something familiar in her face. During the 6 months she worked for Mrs. Margaret, Emily developed a peaceful routine. She woke at 6, prepared breakfast, took care of the mistress's medication, cleaned the immense house with the occasional help of Mr. Harrison, and in her free afternoons explored the gardens with an old analog camera she had found in an abandoned drawer. She photographed the wildflowers, the ruins of a Baroque fountain, the hummingbirds that visited the morning glories at the end of the day. At night, after Mrs. Margaret was asleep, Emily would climb to the attic that served as her room and write in a diary she had kept since adolescence. She described her impressions of the house, the strange dreams she had been having, the constant feeling that she knew every corner of the property even before she had set foot there. She dreamed on feverish nights of dark corridors, voices whispering in French, a young woman crying in a jasmine garden. Mrs. Margaret's death had been sudden. One December morning, Emily found her in her bed, serene as if she had simply decided not to wake up anymore. The funeral was discreet. Only a few acquaintances from Oakwood Hills and the family lawyer attended. Michael was in Vienna, sheltered from the scandals, and did not return even to bury his grandmother. Mr. Harrison explained to Emily that she could stay on the property until the inheritance issues were resolved. The salary would continue to be paid by the family's estate administrator, and her function would be to keep the house in order for an eventual sale. Emily gratefully accepted. She had nowhere to go, and something inside her refused to abandon that place. They were lonely months. Emily began living alone in the immensity of the mansion, accompanied only by Mr. Harrison during the day and by silent ghosts during the nights. She began to explore previously forbidden rooms, discovering forgotten treasures, a library with first editions of classic American literature, a grand piano covered in dust, family portraits framed in silver. It was during one of these explorations that she found an entire wing of the house that remained locked. Mr. Harrison said they were the private quarters of the family's son, Michael, who was traveling on business, a euphemism that Emily didn't question. But on a suffocating summer afternoon, when the heat made her small attic room unbearable, Emily decided to defy the prohibition. She used a bunch of old keys she had found in Mrs. Margaret's drawer to open the door to the main bedroom of that wing. The room was preserved like a museum. Noble wood furniture, artwork on the walls, a huge bed with carved wooden canopy. The windows offered the most beautiful view of the property, the verdant valley extending to the sea, the colonial town of Oakwood Hills glittering in the distance. Emily couldn't resist. She took a bath in the marble bathroom, lay down on the soft bed to rest just a few minutes, and was overcome by a deep sleep that kept her unconscious for hours. It was there, in that state of absolute vulnerability, that fate finally decided to bring face to face two souls who carried, unknowingly, fragments of the same tragic story. Emily woke to the sound of footsteps on the floor below. For a moment, lost between sleep and wakefulness, she couldn't remember where she was. The golden light of the afternoon filtered through the linen curtains, creating dancing patterns on the walls. When reality hit her like a bucket of cold water, she jumped out of bed, her heart racing. She had slept in the forbidden room for hours, completely naked, vulnerable as a child. She dressed hastily, listening to muffled voices coming from the ground floor. One of them was unmistakably Mr. Harrison's, but the other, a male voice, deep and tired, was completely unknown. Emily descended the back stairs, those formerly used by the servants, trying to reach the kitchen without being seen. She needed to understand who had arrived, whether she should hide or introduce herself. Through the kitchen door crack, she could see part of the main room. A tall man with broad shoulders was talking to Mr. Harrison. He wore a dark coat over a wrinkled white shirt, and his brown hair was disheveled, as if he had just woken up from a long journey. Even from behind, his presence emanated a natural authority, an elegance that contrasted with the evident fatigue in his gestures. "The house is exactly as I left it," Emily heard him say, with a refined accent that betrayed privileged education. "You've done an impeccable job, Mr. Harrison." "Master Michael didn't notify us he was coming," replied the butler, visibly emotional. "Had I known, I would have prepared everything," notified Emily. Michael. The name hit her like lightning. This was Michael Anderson, the heir to the scandals, the man who had abandoned his family and the country when his reputation crumbled. Emily had seen his face in the newspapers months before, blurred photographs of a man entering European airports, always avoiding the cameras. But in person he was different from what she expected, less arrogant, more fragile. "Emily?" Michael repeated the name as if savoring each syllable. "The girl my grandmother hired?" "Yes, sir. A hard-working, discreet girl. She took care of Mrs. Margaret with great affection in the last months." Mr. Harrison hesitated before continuing. "She was very shaken by the mistress's death. She had nowhere to go, so I allowed her to continue living here. I hope you don't mind." "Of course not." Michael turned slightly, and Emily could see his profile. Aristocratic features, but marked by a deep sadness that aged his face. There was something magnetic about him, a wounded masculine beauty that simultaneously aroused attraction and compassion. "Where is she now?" Emily felt her mouth go dry. She couldn't simply appear as if she didn't know who he was, nor could she continue hiding. She took a deep breath and pushed the kitchen door, entering the room with all the dignity she could muster. "Good afternoon," she said, keeping her voice firm despite her nervousness. "I'm Emily." Michael turned completely, and when their eyes met, the world seemed to stop. He studied her unhurriedly, from her hair still disheveled from sleep to her bare feet on the cold marble floor. There was no malice in his gaze, but an intense curiosity, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Emily," he repeated, extending his hand. "Michael Anderson, pleasure to meet you." The handshake was firm, but Emily noticed an almost imperceptible tremor in his fingers. When their skins touched, an electric current ran through her arm, making her instinctively back away. Michael seemed to feel the same thing as he quickly withdrew his hand, tucking it into his coat pocket. "I'm very sorry for the loss of your grandmother," said Emily, genuinely touched. "Mrs. Margaret was a special lady." "Thank you." Michael lowered his eyes, and Emily realized that his grandmother's death had affected him more than he showed. "I know you took good care of her," Mr. Harrison told me. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Emily felt she should say something about her situation, explain why she was still in the house, but the words seemed inadequate. Michael, in turn, fought against the impulse to tell her that he had seen her sleeping, that image was indelibly etched in his mind. "I imagine you want me to leave the property," Emily finally said, raising her chin in a gesture of wounded pride. "I can pack my bags today." "No." The answer came faster and more emphatic than Michael intended. Emily looked at him in surprise, and he hurried to explain. "I mean, you don't need to leave immediately. This house is too big to be abandoned, if you don't mind continuing to take care of it for a while longer." "I don't mind," replied Emily, unable to disguise the relief in her voice. "I like being here." Michael nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her blush. There was something in those honey-colored eyes that completely disheveled her, an old pain that mirrored her own loneliness. Without understanding why, she felt the urge to touch his face, to offer some comfort for that evident sadness. "Well," said Mr. Harrison, breaking the moment of tension, "I'll get your bags from the car. Emily, how about preparing some tea? I'm sure Master Michael is tired from the journey." Emily nodded, grateful for the distraction. She headed to the kitchen, aware that Michael was watching her. Her hands trembled slightly as she put the kettle on the fire, as she chose the porcelain cups that Mrs. Margaret reserved for special occasions. She felt his presence even without seeing him, as if a magnetic force connected her to every movement he made. The following days established a strange routine charged with undeclared tension. Michael settled in the ground-floor guest room, deliberately avoiding returning to his quarters on the upper floor. He told himself it was not to disturb Emily, but the truth was more complex. He couldn't separate that space from the image of her asleep, naked and vulnerable among his sheets. Emily tried to keep her distance, performing her duties with the professional discretion she had learned in the shelters. She cleaned the house at times when Michael went out for long walks around the property, prepared his meals, and left them covered in the kitchen, collected his dirty clothes when he wasn't around. But something had changed irreversibly. She felt his presence even when he was absent, as if the air of the mansion had gained a new electric density. Michael began to move around the house at strange hours. He would appear in the library when she was cleaning the shelves, emerge on the veranda when she was watering the plants, cross paths with her in the corridors, with a frequency that couldn't be mere coincidence. He wasn't intrusive. On the contrary, his gentleness was almost frightening. He asked if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, if she didn't feel lonely in that immense mansion. "You take photographs," he said one afternoon when he found her in the garden with the analog camera in her hands. It wasn't a question, but an observation made with genuine interest. Emily lowered the camera, slightly embarrassed at having been caught using an object that technically belonged to the family. "I found this camera in one of the rooms. I hope you don't mind. I can return it if—" "No." Michael approached a few steps, observing the vintage machine with nostalgia. "It was my grandfather's. He was passionate about photography. He developed his own films in the improvised laboratory in the basement." He paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Do you have talent?" "I don't know," Emily answered honestly. "I never had the resources to develop the photos. I just like capturing moments, the flowers, the light changing during the day, the details that people don't notice." Michael studied her for a long moment, noting how her eyes lit up when she talked about photography. It was the first time he had seen her completely relaxed, without the defensive tension she always maintained whenever they were in the same room. "The laboratory still works," he said finally. "If you want, I can show you how to develop the films." Emily looked at him in amazement. That offer was too intimate, too generous for an employer to offer an employee. "I don't want to bother you." "You don't bother me, Emily." He pronounced her name slowly, as if it were a word in a foreign language he was learning. Actually, it would be nice to have company. That's how the afternoons in the improvised basement laboratory began. Michael taught Emily the secrets of analog development, how to mix the chemicals, control the temperature of the baths, calculate exposure times. They worked side by side in the reddish half-light, their hands occasionally touching when they passed materials to each other. Emily discovered that Michael was a patient teacher, knowledgeable not only about the technique, but the art behind each choice. He praised her compositions, pointed out details she hadn't noticed, suggested experiments with different aperture settings. When the first images began to emerge on the photographic paper, emerging from nothing like magic, Emily couldn't contain a cry of joy. "It's incredible," she murmured, watching a photo of the garden jasmines taking shape in the developer. "It's as if I were creating life." Michael watched her more than the photographs. The expression of pure enchantment on her face touched him in an unexpected way. It had been years since he had felt pleasure in teaching someone something. Years since he had seen such genuine passion for an art that he himself loved. "You have a special eye," he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. "You see beauty where others see only the everyday." Their eyes met in the half-light of the laboratory, and for an instant, the world seemed to reduce to that tiny space, to that moment charged with possibilities. Emily felt her heart dangerously accelerate. Michael was so close that she could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle scent of his cologne, mixed with the smell of photographic chemicals. "Emily," he began, his voice almost a whisper. She instinctively backed away, knocking over a bottle of fixer that shattered on the cement floor. The noise broke the spell like a shot. Michael immediately moved away, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration with himself. "I'm sorry," murmured Emily, crouching to collect the glass shards. "I'm so clumsy." "No." Michael knelt beside her, gently holding her wrists to prevent her from cutting herself on the fragments. "I should be the one to apologize. I shouldn't have—" They remained like that for long seconds, kneeling on the laboratory floor, him holding her delicate wrists, both breathing irregularly. Emily felt Michael's thumb tracing unconscious circles on her skin, such an intimate gesture that it made her shiver. "Mr. Michael," she said, forcing formality into her voice, "perhaps it's better if I go upstairs. It's getting late." He released her wrists immediately as if he had been burned. "Of course, you're right." Emily left the laboratory without looking back, but carried with her the sensation of his hands on her skin. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the attic, she couldn't push from her mind the intensity of Michael's gaze, the way he pronounced her name, the electricity that arose whenever they accidentally touched. Michael, in turn, spent the night walking through the gardens under the fine summer rain, trying to understand what was happening to him. Emily wasn't just a beautiful employee. It was something deeper, more disturbing. There was in her a combination of fragility and strength that completely disordered him, that made him question all the barriers he had built around his heart. The weeks dragged on in a dangerous game of approach and distance. Michael gifted Emily with a new camera, a vintage Leica he found in an antique shop in Oakwood Hills, saying that the grandfather's old camera deserved to rest. Emily protested, claiming it was too expensive a gift, but he insisted with an intensity that made it impossible to refuse. "It's an investment in your talent," he said, placing the camera delicately in her hands. "My grandfather always said that quality equipment is an extension of the artist's soul." Emily held the camera as if it were made of crystal, moved not only by the present itself, but by the way Michael saw her, not as a simple employee, but as someone with artistic potential worthy of being cultivated. That night, she wrote entire pages in her diary about the sensation of being seen, really seen by someone for the first time in her life. The days began to gain an intimate routine that neither dared to name. They had breakfast together on the veranda overlooking the valley, Michael reading passages from French newspapers aloud, while Emily listened, fascinated by the musicality of his voice, speaking in a foreign language. He began to tell stories about his travels through Europe, describing museums in Paris, vineyards in Tuscany, concerts in Vienna, with a richness of detail that transported Emily to worlds she had never imagined stepping into. "One day you should travel," he said one morning, watching her photograph a hummingbird visiting the hibiscus flowers. "See how the light is different in each place, how each culture sees beauty." "People like me don't travel through Europe," replied Emily with a bitter laugh. "I can barely afford a ticket to River City." Michael stopped reading the newspaper and looked at her with a seriousness that disconcerted her. "Don't say that. You are not people like me. You are unique, Emily. Extraordinary." The intensity in his voice made her blush. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, as if she were capable of conquering the world or completely falling apart, depending on his next words. "You don't really know me," she murmured, lowering the camera. "You don't know where I come from, what I've already done to survive." "Then tell me," said Michael, approaching a few steps. "I want to know everything about you." But Emily backed away, frightened by her own vulnerability. Some pasts are better left where they are. It was during this time that she began to systematically explore the mansion. There was an entire wing that remained locked. Not Michael's quarters, which she already knew, but an older section of the house, with narrow corridors and rooms that seemed not to have been opened for decades. Her curiosity was piqued when she found old keys in a kitchen drawer labeled with different calligraphies. One afternoon, when Michael went out to resolve legal issues in town, Emily decided to challenge her own limitations. She tried several keys until she managed to open a heavy door of dark wood. On the other side, she found a dusty corridor that led to a suite forgotten by time. The room was preserved like a sanctuary. Delicate feminine furniture, a cabinet piano covered with dust, mirrors framed in silver that reflected the light filtered through yellowed curtains. But what caught her attention was an antique writing desk, on which there was a carved wooden box containing letters yellowed by time. With trembling hands, Emily opened the first letter. The calligraphy was feminine, elegant, and the date indicated 1999. "My dear Margaret," the letter began, "I can no longer keep this secret that is consuming me from within." Emily read with her heart racing. The sender signed only as S, and the letters related a forbidden love affair, an unwanted pregnancy, threats from a powerful family. One of the letters, dated October 1999, was particularly disturbing. "They want to force me to give the baby up for adoption, claiming that impure blood cannot stain the family name. Margaret, you are my only hope." The last letter, from December 1999, was desperate. "I couldn't resist the pressure. I gave up my daughter early this morning, a beautiful girl with your eyes and your smile. I told the nuns that the father was unknown, that there was no family. I lied to protect her from the hatred that surrounds this place. If she ever looks for me, tell her that I loved her more than my own life." Emily let the letter fall, her hands trembling violently. The date coincided exactly with her birth, the descriptions of the child, the details about the abandonment at the convent. Everything fit in a frightening way with her own story. "What are you doing here?" Emily spun around, startled. Michael was at the door, his face a mask of shock and something that seemed to be panic. His clothes were wet from the rain that had begun to fall outside, and his eyes quickly scanned the room, stopping at the letters scattered on the table. "I found these letters," stammered Emily, trying to compose herself. "Michael, I need to know, this woman, this S, do you know who she was?" Michael approached slowly, as if he were dealing with an injured animal. He picked up one of the letters, read some excerpts, and Emily saw a complex range of emotions passing across his face. Recognition, pain, something that seemed like old guilt. "It was Stella," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Stella Walker. She worked here when I was a teenager." "Walker." Emily repeated the surname as if it were a revelation. "That's my surname." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked at her with a new, dangerous intensity, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Emily felt the world tilt beneath her feet, all the pieces of her life beginning to form a picture she wasn't prepared to see. "Emily," said Michael, his voice loaded with an emotion she couldn't identify, "I need to tell you something about this family, about my father, about what happened to Stella." But before he could continue, Emily was already running, fleeing from that room and those truths that threatened to destroy everything she believed about herself. She ran through the rain to her small room in the attic, locked the door and threw herself on the bed, sobbing as she hadn't done since childhood. Down below, Michael remained motionless in the abandoned room, holding the letters of a dead woman, facing the terrible possibility that the only person he had fallen in love with in years could be his half-sister. Emily spent 3 days locked in her room, refusing to come down even for meals. Mr. Harrison brought up trays of food that she barely touched, worried about that sudden change in the young woman who had become almost a daughter to him. Michael prowled the house like a ghost, frequently stopping before the stairs that led to the attic, but never having the courage to go up. On the third night, when the rain returned to fall forcefully on the colonial roof, Emily finally emerged from her isolation. She descended the stairs barefoot, still wearing the same dress from 3 days ago, her hair disheveled and her eyes swollen from crying so much. She found Michael in the library, drinking whiskey and obsessively rereading Stella's letters. "I need to know the truth," she said, her voice hoarse but determined. "The whole truth." Michael raised his eyes from the papers, and Emily saw that he too hadn't slept. His beard was unshaven, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a vulnerability in his gaze that she had never seen before. "Sit down," he asked, indicating the armchair before the fireplace. "It's a long and painful story." Emily settled in, hugging her own legs like a frightened child. Michael served 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to her. Emily refused with a head gesture, so he drank his own in one gulp before beginning. "Stella arrived here in 1998. She was 18, the same age as I was at the time. She was the daughter of the gardener who had been taking care of the property for years, a simple and honest man named John Walker. Michael paused, as if the following words were difficult to pronounce. My father was going through a turbulent phase in his marriage. My mother had discovered some of his infidelities and threatened to leave with half the fortune. Emily watched him attentively, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he held the empty glass. Stella was luminous. She had a natural beauty that contrasted with all the artificiality that surrounded our family. She worked in the house during the day, taking care of the cleaning and helping in the kitchen, but at night she studied to finish high school. She dreamed of going to college for literature, wanted to be a teacher. And your father, Emily managed to murmur, though she feared the answer. My father seduced her, said Michael, his voice laden with disgust. It was calculated, deliberate. He knew exactly how to manipulate a young girl, full of dreams, who had never received attention from a powerful man. He promised to pay for her studies, give her a better life. All the lies that men like him used to justify their crimes. Emily closed her eyes, feeling nauseous. The story sounded terribly familiar, echoing the fragments she'd heard about her own origin. When Stella became pregnant, my father panicked. My grandmother Margaret discovered the affair and was furious, not for the betrayal itself, but for the fact that it was with an employee, someone from the working class. For her, that was a stain on the family's reputation that needed to be immediately eliminated. Michael stood up, walking to the window where he observed the rain falling on the gardens that John Walker had taken care of with so much love. They made a terrible proposal to Stella, $500,000 for her to disappear, give the child up for adoption, and never speak about what happened again. If she refused, my father guaranteed that he would destroy her life and her father's. John Walker would lose his job, and they would make sure they never got work anywhere again. She accepted, whispered Emily, tears beginning to roll down her face. She had no choice. She was a 19-year-old girl, pregnant, scared, without resources to fight against a powerful family. So she took the money, gave you up for adoption with a false name so they could never trace you back to our family, and disappeared. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain and Emily's sobs. Michael turned, seeing her bent over herself, trembling like a leaf in the wind. Where is she now? Emily managed to ask between tears. Michael returned to her side, kneeling before her armchair. Emily, Stella died 2 years later. Overdose of tranquilizers in a cheap hotel in Lakewood. The police said it was suicide. The words hit Emily like physical punches. She doubled over even more, an animal moan escaping from her throat. Michael extended his hands to touch her, but stopped midway, remembering who they might be to each other. She left a letter, he continued, his voice breaking. I only discovered its existence when my father died and I found his personal papers. Stella wrote that you were the only good thing that had resulted from that terrible situation, that she loved you more than her own life, but that giving you up had been the only way to protect you from our family's hatred. Emily raised her face, her red eyes fixed on his. So it's true, I'm your sister. Half-sister, corrected Michael, but the word came out loaded with horror. Emily, I didn't know. When you arrived here, when I felt what I felt for you, I had no idea. What did you feel for me? She asked, her voice dangerously low. Michael hesitated, fighting against the truth that could make everything even more sordid. Passion, he finally admitted, a passion that frightened me from the first moment. You made me feel alive again, Emily. For the first time in years, I wanted to be a better man. Emily rose abruptly, moving away from him as if his proximity were toxic. This is repugnant. We are family, Michael, siblings, and I also felt— Don't say it, he pleaded, standing up too. Please don't make this even more difficult. But Emily was beyond reason. I fell in love with you, she shouted, the words echoing through the silent library. I fell in love with the son of the man who destroyed my mother, with my own brother. Michael recoiled as if he had been slapped. The truth, raw and brutal, was finally exposed between them. All the desire, all the connection, all the promise of happiness that had grown in the last weeks was now poisoned by the revelation of who they really were. Emily, listen, he began. But she was already running again, fleeing not only from him, but from herself, from her own feelings, from the cruel impossibility of her fate. Emily disappeared for an entire week. Michael woke up the morning after the devastating confession and found only a note on the kitchen table. "I need time to think. Don't look for me." Her clothes had disappeared from the small attic room, as well as the camera he had given her as a gift. Mr. Harrison, questioned desperately, said only that he had seen her leave at dawn, carrying a small suitcase and crying. Michael spent those days in a downward spiral of guilt and despair. He drank more than he should, completely neglected his appearance, and spent hours walking through the gardens where John Walker had worked, trying to imagine what life would be like if he had been brave enough to denounce his own father's crimes years ago. It was Mr. Harrison who, on the 5th day, had the courage to confront him. He found Michael sleeping drunk in the library, surrounded by empty bottles and scattered papers. "Master Michael," said the butler, his voice charged with an authority that transcended his social position, "you need to stop this. The girl needs you now." "She can't need me," murmured Michael, without raising his head from the table where he had fallen asleep. I can't even say what we are without feeling disgusted with myself." Mr. Harrison pulled up a chair and sat before the master he had raised since childhood. "May I speak frankly?" Michael made a vague gesture of agreement. "I knew about Stella and your father. I knew and hated myself all these years for not having had the courage to interfere." The old man's voice trembled slightly. "But I also know something that you don't know." Michael finally raised his eyes, focusing with difficulty on the butler's serious face. "Stella sought me out before she died. She came here one night, 2 years after leaving. She was thin, sick, clearly addicted to medications. She wanted to see the house one last time, said she missed the garden her father took care of. Why did you never tell me this? Because you were in Europe, studying, and because she made me promise to keep the secret." Mr. Harrison hesitated, as if he were deciding to cross a dangerous line. "But she told me something important that night, the truth about the child's father." Michael straightened in his chair, suddenly sober. "What do you mean?" "Stella never had a relationship with your father, Master Michael. Never. She was in love with another young man, Marcus, the son of the town's mechanic. They had been dating in secret for months when she became pregnant." The world seemed to stop around Michael. "But the letters she wrote to my grandmother." "Stella agreed to take the blame when your grandmother discovered the pregnancy. Mrs. Margaret automatically assumed that the child was your father's because she couldn't conceive that an employee would have her own love life. And when they offered that absurd amount of money in exchange for her silence, Stella saw an opportunity to guarantee a better future for her daughter." Michael stood up, staggering, trying to process the information. "So Emily is not your sister?" "She never was. She is just the daughter of a brave woman who sacrificed herself to protect the child from this family's greed and prejudice." Mr. Harrison rose too, placing a paternal hand on Michael's shoulder. "Stella made me swear that if the girl ever appeared here looking for the truth, I would tell her. She said she didn't want the sins of this house to forever stain her daughter's life." Michael collapsed in an armchair, his hands covering his face. Relief, guilt, and despair mixed in his chest in an overwhelming way. Emily was not his sister, but he had allowed her to believe it for days, letting her carry a guilt that wasn't hers. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice muffled by his hands. "At an inn in Oakwood Hills in the Historic Center. Moonlight Inn, room 6. She's working as a waitress in the restaurant to pay for the lodging." Michael ran to the bathroom, took a cold shower, shaved, and put on clean clothes for the first time in days. The trip to the historic town had never seemed so long. When he arrived at the inn, a charming colonial building in the heart of Oakwood Hills, it was almost night. He found Emily in the small restaurant attached to the inn, serving tables with the mechanical efficiency of someone who was trying to keep her mind occupied. She wore a simple dress and a white apron, her hair tied in an unpretentious bun. When she saw him enter, she almost dropped the tray she was carrying. "Michael," she whispered, her face paling. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, aware that other customers were watching them curiously. "Please." Emily hesitated, then excused herself to the restaurant owner and went out to the small internal patio of the inn. The night was clear, with stars shining over the colonial stones of the town. "Emily, you need to know," Michael began, but she interrupted him. "I don't want to hear excuses or justifications," she said, her arms crossed defensively. "I spent the whole week trying to accept the reality of what we are, what we feel. It's wrong, Michael. Sick. I need to go on with my life away from you. You are not my sister." The words came out simple, direct, like a shot in the silence of the night. Emily blinked, confused. "What?" Michael approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal about to flee. "You are not my sister, Emily. Your father was not my father. Stella took the blame for something she didn't do, to protect you and your real father." Emily backed away, leaning against the stone wall. "That's impossible. The letters, the story. Your father was Marcus Davis, son of the town's mechanic. Stella was in love with him. They were dating in secret. When she got pregnant, my family automatically assumed that the child was my father's, because they couldn't imagine that an employee would have her own love life." Tears began to roll down Emily's face as Michael told her everything Mr. Harrison had revealed. The truth about Marcus, about Stella's sacrifice, about how she had carried a guilt that was never hers. "Why didn't she tell the truth?" asked Emily, her voice breaking. "Because my family offered $500,000 for her to disappear and take the secret with her. For a poor, pregnant and frightened girl, that was a fortune, a chance to ensure that you would have a better future." Emily slid down the wall until she sat on the irregular stone floor of the patio. Michael knelt before her, finally daring to touch her face with his fingertips. "Forgive me for having let you suffer these days believing a lie," he whispered. "Forgive my family for what they did to your mother, and if you can, forgive me for having fallen in love with you the moment I saw you sleeping in my bed." Emily looked into Michael's eyes for a long moment, as if she were looking for hidden lies in the golden depths of his gaze. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile whisper. "How can I be sure it's true? How can I trust a family that has lied and manipulated for so long?" Michael understood her distrust. Slowly, he took from his pocket an old letter, yellowed by time. "Stella left this with Mr. Harrison before she died. A letter for you, in case you ever appeared looking for the truth." With trembling hands, Emily took the paper. The calligraphy was the same as in the letters she had read, but these words were different, intimate, charged with a maternal love she had never known. "My dear daughter," Emily read aloud, tears blurring her vision. "If you are reading this, it means you have found your way back home. I want you to know that you were conceived in love, in the pure love I felt for Marcus, a good and honest young man who wanted me as much as I wanted him. I let everyone believe a lie because it was the only way to protect him and to ensure that you would have a chance at a better life. The Andersons' money paid for your studies at a private school, ensured that you were well cared for. It was the price I paid for your happiness, and I would pay it again 1,000 times. Emily stopped reading, sobbing. Michael moved closer, carefully enveloping her in his arms. This time, she did not move away. "Continue," he asked softly. "Marcus never knew the truth. I told him that I had gotten involved with another man, broke his heart to protect him from the Andersons' fury. He married 2 years later and has a happy family in River Bend. Don't try to find him. Some wounds are better left in peace, but know that you have the blood of good, hard-working people who truly loved each other. You carry no stain, no sin. You are free to love and be loved without restrictions." The letter ended with an address in River Bend and the words, "Be happy, my girl. Be the strong woman I didn't have the courage to be." Emily folded the letter against her chest, finally allowing Michael to embrace her completely. They stayed like that for long minutes, in the silent patio of the inn, healing wounds they didn't even know they carried. "Will you look for Marcus?" asked Michael when she calmed down. "I don't know," admitted Emily. "Maybe someday. But now I just want to understand what we are, the two of us." Michael moved away slightly to look into her eyes. "We are two people who fell in love, despite all the circumstances. We are free to love each other, Emily. Finally, free." But Emily hesitated. "And your family? Your social position?" "I'm still the daughter of the Maid, Michael. That hasn't changed." "Then be," he said with an intensity that surprised her. "Be the daughter of a brave woman who sacrificed herself for love. Be the talented woman who photographs beauty where others see only the everyday. Be the person who makes me want to be better every day. That's all that matters." That night, Emily returned to the mansion, not as an employee, but as a woman who finally knew her own story. Michael installed her in the main room of the guest wing, a spacious room with a view of the gardens that her biological grandfather had cared for with so much love. The following days were of discoveries and reconstruction. Emily found in the town archives certificates that proved Marcus Davis's story. He had indeed married and started a family in River Bend, exactly as Stella had written. Michael, in turn, used his contacts to discreetly investigate the past, confirming every detail of Mr. Harrison's version. "I want to do something for her," said Emily one afternoon as they walked through the gardens. "For Stella, some way to honor her sacrifice." Michael stopped before a wild rose bush that grew where there once had been an organized flower bed. "What would you like to do?" "A photographic project. Document stories of women like her, women who were silenced, who sacrificed themselves, who were judged by society." Emily looked at him with a new determination shining in her eyes. "I want to create exhibitions, maybe a book, give voice to the voices that were silenced." "It's a beautiful project," said Michael, gently touching her face, "and I want to help you accomplish it. I have contacts in the art world, resources, influence. Let's use all of that for something that really matters." It was then that Emily realized she wasn't just falling in love with Michael. She was falling in love with the possibility of a life with purpose, of a partnership that could transform pain into art, tragedy into hope. That night they dined together on the veranda, talking about plans and dreams until late hours. When the time came to say goodnight, Michael hesitated before the door to Emily's room. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice hoarse with desire contained for weeks. In response, Emily approached, placing her hands on his chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Finally, yes." The kiss was soft at first, almost reverent, as if they were sealing a sacred pact. Then it deepened, charged with all the repressed passion, all the desire they had denied themselves. When they separated, both were breathing with difficulty. "I love you," said Michael, the words coming out without censorship. "I've loved you since the first moment, and now I can say it without guilt." "I love you too," replied Emily, smiling through tears of joy. "I love your gentleness, your intelligence, the way you make me feel precious. I even love your contradictions and your wounds." They kissed again, more urgently this time, their hands exploring, their bodies pressing against each other. But when Michael began to unbutton her dress, Emily placed her hands over his. "Not here," she said softly. "Not yet. I want our first time to be perfect, without shadows from the past." Michael nodded, understanding. He kissed her forehead tenderly. "I'll wait as long as necessary. You're worth all the patience in the world." 2 weeks of almost perfect happiness followed. Emily and Michael spent the days exploring Oakwood Hills together, photographing the colonial architecture, talking with local artisans, discovering stories that could integrate her future project. Michael introduced her to gallery owners from River City by phone, and there was already genuine interest in an exhibition about silenced women in American society. But the piece was brutally interrupted on a Saturday morning when a black car parked in front of the mansion gates. From inside emerged 2 men in suits, a lawyer and a private investigator hired by Helen Anderson, Michael's aunt, and the only living relative who maintained contact with the family. Helen was a 60-year-old woman, widow of a Lakewood industrialist, known for her influence in conservative social circles. For years, she had been trying to get Michael to return to Lakewood, take over the remaining family businesses, and marry someone suitable from his social class. "Michael," she said, entering the mansion's main room as if she were still its owner, "we need to talk, alone." Emily, who was organizing photographs on the mahogany table, immediately felt the hostility in the air. Helen examined her from head to toe with the glacial gaze that only women of the elite know how to use as a weapon. "Excuse me," murmured Emily, beginning to collect her materials. "You don't need to leave," said Michael, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Helen, this is Emily, my girlfriend." The silence that followed was cutting. Helen smiled, but it was the kind of smile that precedes an execution. "How interesting," she said finally. "Your girlfriend? And what is your full surname, dear?" Emily felt the danger in the question, but answered with dignity. "Emily Stella Walker Davis." "Walker," repeated Helen, savoring each syllable. "What a remarkable coincidence. You know, I brought some interesting documents that I would like to share with you both." From her leather briefcase, Helen withdrew a thick folder. My private investigator did a very thorough job. He discovered fascinating things about the Walker family. Michael tensed beside Emily. Helen, what are you doing? Protecting the family name, as I always have. Helen opened the folder, revealing photographs, certificates, and old documents. For example, we discovered that John Walker, Stella's father, had a considerable debt with loan sharks before he began working here. Debts that were mysteriously paid off soon after Stella left home with a substantial amount of money. Emily felt the floor move beneath her feet. What are you insinuating? I'm not insinuating anything, dear. I'm stating. Stella Walker was not a victim of our family. She was an accomplice in an elaborate extortion. Helen placed a photograph on the table. John Walker signing documents at a lottery shop. Your grandfather used his daughter to blackmail our patriarch. The pregnancy was a perfect opportunity to extract money from a rich family. That's a lie, exploded Emily, but her voice came out less convincing than she would have liked. Helen continued, implacable. Even more interesting is to discover that Marcus Davis, the supposed secret boyfriend, received $50,000 to confirm the story if he was questioned. Money that he used to open his mechanic shop in River Bend. Michael picked up the documents, examining them with growing horror. The signatures seemed authentic, the dates coincided, and there were even photographs of Marcus depositing checks in a bank account. Helen, even if this were true, it doesn't change anything between Emily and me, he said, but his voice had lost part of its conviction. It doesn't? Helen laughed. Michael, you're being manipulated by the daughter of the woman who blackmailed your family. Can't you see the pattern? She appears here out of nowhere, seduces you with a touching story of orphanhood, and now has complete access to our inheritance. Emily backed away, as if she had been slapped. You think that I planned all this? Michael looked at her, and Emily saw something terrible happening in his eyes, doubt beginning to infiltrate like poison. Michael, said Helen softly, remember the scandals that destroyed your reputation. They started exactly like this, you trusting the wrong people. Get out, said Emily, her voice trembling with anger and pain. Get out of my sight before I do something I'll regret. Your sight? Helen laughed with disdain. Dear, you've been in my family's house for less than a year. This was never your house. Emily turned to Michael, looking for support in his eyes, but what she found was confusion, fear, and worse still, a distance that wasn't there minutes before. Michael, she whispered, do you believe her? After everything we've been through, do you really think I'm capable of... Michael hesitated, the documents trembling in his hands. I need time to process this. The words hit Emily like stabs. Time to process, she repeated, her voice laden with bitterness. Of course, because it's much easier to believe that I'm a con artist than to accept that your family committed crimes against innocent people. Emily, it's not that, it's exactly that, she exploded. At the first opportunity, at the first shadow of doubt, you choose to believe her instead of me. You choose to protect the precious Anderson name instead of defending the woman you say you love. Helen watched the scene with evident satisfaction. Michael, you can resolve this in a civilized way. Offer the young woman a generous compensation to leave our lives discreetly. Let's say $100,000. Go to hell, hissed Emily, and take your disgusting proposal with you. She ran up the stairs, Michael shouting her name. But Emily didn't stop. She locked herself in her room, threw her few clothes into a suitcase, and took the camera Michael had given her, now stained by the suspicion that even that gift might have hidden motivations. When she came down again, Helen had departed. But Michael was waiting for her in the hall, his face devastated. Emily, please, let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, she said, walking straight past him. You made your choice. You chose to believe that I am like the ghosts of your past, that I am just another person trying to take advantage of you. That's not true. I just need what? Emily turned, tears finally beginning to fall. More proof that I'm not a criminal? Guarantees that my feelings are genuine? If my love is not sufficient evidence of the truth, then it never will be. She walked toward the door, each step echoing like a funeral on the cold marble of the hall. Emily, don't go, implored Michael. We've stood together against everything until now. We can overcome this too. Emily stopped at the threshold without turning. No, Michael. You won. Your aunt got exactly what she wanted, to make me feel small, dirty, unworthy of your love. And you let her." The door closed behind her with a final sound that echoed through the empty mansion like a shot to the heart. 3 months passed like an endless winter. Emily returned to River City, rented a tiny room in Highland Park and worked as a freelance photographer, capturing social events and weddings to survive. Each click of the camera Michael had given her was a stab of longing, but she refused to sell it. It was the only physical connection that remained with the happiest days of her life. Michael, in turn, plunged into an obsessive investigation of the documents Helen had presented. He hired his own detectives, reviewed every paper, every signature, every bank transaction, and slowly, like pieces of a macabre puzzle, the truth emerged. The documents were fake. Helen had paid a fortune to forge certificates, photographs, and even fictitious bank accounts. Marcus Davis had never received any money. In fact, he continued working as a mechanic in River Bend, barely managing to support his family. John Walker had paid off his debts by working extra nights as a gardener in other properties, not with blackmail money. The discovery of the truth brought relief but also devastating guilt. Michael had doubted Emily at the moment when she most needed his support. He had allowed the fear of being deceived again to destroy the only true love of his life. Mr. Harrison found Michael one September morning, crying in the garden where John Walker had planted the rose bushes that still bloomed. "Master Michael," said the butler gently, "the girl still loves you. I know that." "How can you know?" asked Michael without raising his eyes from the flowers. "Because she calls me every week asking how you are. She never speaks to you, just to me. She wants to know if you're eating well, if you're sleeping, if you're not drinking too much." Mr. Harrison paused. "Yesterday she told me she got her first individual exhibition in a cultural space in downtown. The photographs are about invisible women of the city, domestic workers, street vendors, recycling collectors. She said she's dedicating the exhibition to Stella's memory." Michael raised his head, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and regret. "She managed to realize the project." "She did. And do you know how she got the sponsorship?" Michael shook his head. "She sold the camera you gave her, said she needed to prove to herself that she could get things through her own merit, without depending on anyone." The information hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. Emily had gotten rid of the most precious gift he had given her to finance a dream they had planned together. "Mr. Harrison," said Michael, standing up with sudden determination, "I need to go to River City today. Are you going to try to win her back? I'm going to beg for her forgiveness. And then, if she allows me, I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that she deserves all the love in the world." The exhibition, Silenced Voices, was scheduled to open on a Thursday night. Michael arrived in River City the afternoon before, stayed at a hotel close to the cultural space, and spent the night rehearsing what he would say to Emily. On the night of the opening, the small cultural space was full. Emily had invited many of the women she had photographed, and they circulated through the gallery, seeing their own stories transformed into art. It was a touching scene. Women who had never been truly seen now contemplating their own enlarged and framed images, treated with the dignity of works of art. Michael arrived when the exhibition was already underway. He stopped at the entrance, observing Emily from afar. She wore a simple and elegant black dress, her hair loose falling over her shoulders, a genuine smile illuminating her face as she talked with the visitors. She was thinner. There were dark circles under her eyes, but she radiated a new strength, a confidence she didn't have before. One of the photographs caught his attention. It was a portrait of an elderly woman, sitting in a simple kitchen, her calloused hands resting on her apron. The caption said, "Mrs. Johnson, 67 years old, has worked as a domestic worker for 50 years. I raised other people's children as if they were my own. Now my own children visit me on Sundays if they can." Michael moved through the exhibition, reading each story, admiring Emily's talent for capturing not just images, but souls. In the center of the gallery, there was a photograph larger than the others, a portrait of a young woman smiling, clearly taken decades ago. The caption was simple: Stella Walker, 1980-2001. Mother, daughter, woman. Her story will not be forgotten. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Michael turned. Emily was beside him, observing the photograph of her mother. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking. You came," she said simply. "I didn't think you would." "Of course I came. I needed to see what you accomplished. I needed to apologize." Emily guided him to a more reserved corner of the gallery. "Michael, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." Michael took a deep breath. "I was a coward, Emily. At the first real difficulty, the first time our love was truly tested, I faltered. I let fear speak louder than trust. I let you feel abandoned when I should have fought for us." "And the investigation?" asked Emily calmly. "Did you discover the truth about the documents?" "They were false, all of them. Helen paid a fortune to fabricate evidence that would separate us." Michael held her hands, noticing that she didn't resist. "Emily, can you forgive me? Not for the lies I believed, but for having doubted your love." Emily studied him for a long moment. "Do you know what I learned in these months?" Michael shook his head. "I learned that I can survive without you, that I am stronger than I imagined. I built a career, made friends, created my own life." She paused. "But I also learned that surviving is not the same as living." "Emily, I love you, Michael. I never stopped loving you, not even when I was most furious. But if we get back together, I need your promise that you will always choose to trust me, even when the whole world says otherwise." "I promise," he said without hesitation. "I promise that I will choose you every day, in every situation, for the rest of my life." Emily smiled then, the first true smile she had directed at him in months. "Then yes, I forgive you. And yes, I still want to try." Michael kissed her right there in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by the photographs of the women whose voices Emily had decided to amplify. When they separated, both were crying. "I have a proposal," said Michael, drying the tears from her face. "How about we transform that mansion in Oakwood Hills into a cultural center, a place where artists can exhibit, where stories like these can be told? And Helen, your family? Helen lost any right to an opinion when she tried to destroy us with lies. As for the rest of the family," Michael shrugged. "They've already lost everything they could lose from me. Now I only care about building something new, something good, with the woman I love." 6 months later, they married in a simple ceremony in the garden of the mansion, now transformed into the Stella Walker Cultural Institute. Mr. Harrison was the best man. Some of the women photographed by Emily were the bridesmaids, and Marcus Davis, finally contacted and informed about the whole truth, attended to represent Stella's memory. Emily wore her own mother's wedding dress, found among the belongings that John Walker had kept all those years. Michael cried when he saw her walking through the garden, that now served not only as a romantic setting, but as a symbol of all the stories that had been silenced and now found voice. And when they kissed as husband and wife, sealing not just their love, but also the promise to dedicate their lives to doing justice to forgotten voices, the bougainvilleas that grew over the ancient walls seemed to bloom even more intensely, as if nature itself were celebrating the victory of love over prejudice, of truth over lies, of hope over fear.